Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the second in this series of webinars organized under the auspices of Katiba Institute, the Office of Human Rights, the UN Office of Human Rights in Nairobi, and the Social Justice Center's Working Group. Since the organizational side of it is being done by Katiba Institute, I thought it would be appropriate to ask our Executive Director, Christine Mponge, to formally welcome everybody to this event.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So good morning, everyone. As Jill has indicated, I would like to formally welcome all of you to this second webinar, the second webinar in a series of 3, as part of our activities to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Constitution. So we will be looking at implementation of social, economic, and cultural rights today, and looking at where we were before, what the 2010 Constitution promised, and what the current state of affairs is. So as Jill has indicated, this is an activity that has been organized by Katiba Institute, the Social Justice Center's Working Group, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Kenya. So I hope we have a very informative and interactive session. And because of the panelists we have with us, I'm sure that we will actually be able to do so. So welcome. Thank you, Jill.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. And as Christine said, we have a great collection, if I may say so, of panelists with real expertise in their subjects. And I'm going to introduce them all very briefly. Just 2 or 3 sentences about each, which is not doing them at all justice, but we can't spend all our time introducing the people who are going to speak. There is no discernible order to the way in which I'm going to introduce them. Just the question of which pieces of paper I have in front of me. So the first piece of paper is Dr. Elizabeth Kimani Marage, otherwise often known as Liz. She's a senior research scientist at the African Population and Health Research Center, and a Wellcome Trust International Engagement Fellow. She's a public health specialist, public health nutritionist, and human rights defender. And she's leading research in public health issues, especially food and nutrition security among vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a very nice connection, I think, between 2 of the rights that we're discussing today, health and food. If you don't have food, you won't have health. So welcome, Elizabeth. Secondly, we have, but as I say, in no order of anything, Ojango Omondi, who is a human rights defender, and interestingly, an interior designer, and a community leader for the Mathare Social Justice Center. He coordinates a counter-human trafficking network, and he convenes the Article 43 committee at the Social Justice Center's Working Group. Most people probably know what Article 43 is, but in a minute or 2, I shall enlighten those who don't know. Thirdly, I have Alan Achesa Meleche. Alan is the first, and still was the first, and is still the executive director of what is universally known as KELIN, which is in its full name, the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS. He is much awarded for his extremely interesting work. And some of that work he will talk about, I think, today. But for example, he's used the legal framework to safeguard the rights of people and communities affected by HIV and TB through litigating some landmark cases in the Kenyan courts, including Daniel Ngetich and others against the Attorney General, which argued against the incarceration of persons with TB as a public health measure, and then KELIN and the Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Health, which overturned a peculiar directive by the President requiring real names registration of children living with HIV. He is currently a member of the Audit and Finance Committee of the Global Fund Board and a member of the UN AIDS Human Rights Reference Group. Welcome, Alan. Next, we have Pauline Vata. She's the Executive Director of Haki Jamii, another well-known NGO in Nairobi, based in Nairobi, where her role includes providing strategic leadership, programmatic leadership, and working with marginalized groups to advocate for their economic and social rights. She has vast experience in socio-economic rights and has expertise in policy analysis, litigation, and advocacy on housing and land rights for the urban poor. She's a board member of the Community Organizing Trust, a certified mediator, and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, and therefore a member of the Law Society of Kenya. Again, Pauline, you're very welcome. Then we have Linda Noah, who is project manager of the Education Support Program at the East African Center for Human Rights, its short name being EACH Rights. She has worked on research and policy analysis for over 8 years, with key interests in governance, urban development, and human rights. Since 2016, some of her work has focused on bridging information and regulatory gaps regarding the regulation of private actors in education in the region. A very interesting aspect of her work. And then I think that we have one more. It's traditional to say last but not least, but we have Li Feng, who is a senior human rights advisor to the UN resident coordinator in Kenya. She represents the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Kenya. She has over 20 years of experience working in human rights. I have to say we had the pleasure of running into her over 10 years ago now in Cambodia, where she was working at the time. So she's over 20 years experience of working in human rights protection, peace and security, development, humanitarian action, and law in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, and at the United Nations headquarters in New York and Geneva. I think that's everybody, and everybody is extremely welcome, as are the audience, and it's nice to see that we have now 41 participants, presumably including the panelists. We shall have a bit of a conversation. Everybody has things they definitely want to say, and I want to make sure they have the chance to say it. But and then after about halfway through, we shall be throwing the floor open to the participants. And they, I'm sure by this time, are probably familiar with the mechanisms by which they can submit questions through the little bubble which is called Q&A, or the other little bubble which is called chat, which appears at the bottom of your screen. I wanted to begin, though, with a text for the day. It's a simple text, but it is Article 43 of the Constitution of Kenya. Just the first clause. And it sounds very simple. Every person has the right, A, to the highest attainable standard of health, which includes the right to healthcare services, including reproductive health care. B, to accessible and adequate housing and to reasonable standards of sanitation. C, to be free from hunger and to have adequate food of acceptable quality. D, to clean and safe water in adequate quantities. And F, to education. To that I should add, perhaps, that in Article 53, which is the rights of the child, it adds every child has the right to free and compulsory basic education and to basic nutrition, shelter, and healthcare, specific right recognized for children. As I said, Article 43 sounds simple, but I'm sure that participants who are not, as it were, part of the Article 43 world, spend their time thinking about it, maybe asking themselves questions like, how do these rights work? Are they real? So I would like to ask a couple of the panelists, and that others might want to join in, but let me start with some of those, when you look at it and you think, everyone has the right to health. Doesn't quite say that, but or everybody has the right to housing. What does this mean? Are these really rights? I would like to ask maybe Alan Meleche first. Is it really a right, and why do you say so in a sentence or two?
Thanks, Jill, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I believe the right to health is a right, just like a right to vote, a right to security, a right to dignity. The only thing is that the way they're expressed is more in government policy documents, and people see them more as a favor that the government is taking forward more than something that they're entitled to, despite having frameworks that spell about what is needed. Most of the ways our governments, particularly the Kenyan government, has delivered on the right to health has been in a way where they show like they're doing a favor to citizens rather than giving citizens something they must be able to demand for. And for that particular reason, then people don't actually view them as rights or things that they must ask or things that must happen, like an election that happens every 5 years, the same way you need to access your medicine or to be free from sickness or to be in a good mental state. So they are rights, and we want to have that particular conversation around what is the framework, how do we make them operational, what has happened so far, and what is our role as citizens in terms of making this a reality. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Let's hope by the end of our session, people are more convinced that they are rights, even if they don't feel they've been enjoying them. Pauline, would you like to say something about housing as a right? Do you think it's a right, and why do you say that?
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, everybody. Absolutely, the right to housing is a right. I don't think it is. It is a right because, first of all, it's envisaged in our constitution, Article 43, and we have also litigated the right to housing. So really, it's justiciable. We can say that the Constitution protects that right, even though we have very many cases that have litigated against the right to housing, if I may say. And also because it's looked at from the negative aspect only, where you are just supposed to prevent forced evictions and not probably provide housing to, say, the urban poor progressively. And also housing is looked at as, somebody's individual right, like a private right, where Pauline is supposed just to construct her own housing, and maybe government one day, if at all, they can provide housing, but no pressure really. So I think that's where we lose it when it comes to the right to adequate housing. If I can just spotlight a case, two cases for comparative purposes. If you look at the case of Charowaya, it's a 2011 case where 270 households went to court and they were restraining the respondents from forcibly evicting them. And if I can just quote, the court said that it declined to espouse a progressive and purposive interpretation on the right to adequate housing. It called it an aspirational right, and it also failed to adopt a transformative concept. But if you look at Ibrahim Sangor case, on the other hand, which is also a 2011 case, the High Court ruled in favor and said, yes, we have the right to adequate housing in Kenya. Beyond stopping forced evictions, everybody is supposed to be given security of tenure, where you sleep at night and you know that nobody will come and destroy your property. Government is also supposed to put in progressive budgets, supposed to put in progressive policies. So I think the judiciary has also confused very many citizens on what the right to adequate housing means. When there are forced evictions, for example, what we had in Kariobangi or Ruai, if you look at Twitter and what people interpret, in fact, most citizens say, why would you squat on somebody else's property or government property and expect government to give you that particular land? Or why would you live in Kibra expecting government to build you a house? Build a house like everybody else is doing from a circle or from the bank. But you see, what we don't understand as citizens is that we have very many historical injustices that force people to live in Kibra. We have state inaction, because if government acted as it should, we wouldn't be having informal settlement. So really, informal settlement as an aspect of housing shows inaction of government, and by them destroying that particular property or those particular informal settlements, it shows that government has also not understood what housing and what protection of the urban poor means. They have also not understood that housing doesn't mean you have to build everybody a house, but it means that whatever they have is not supposed to be negatively impacted by forceful actions by government. So I'm really hoping through this discussion we can be able to maybe interpret more what the right to adequate housing is beyond scholarly approaches, maybe in just very simple terms. And I'm also looking forward to maybe questions or clarifications on this aspect. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. People may be more familiar with the idea of a right, I think as Alan mentioned, to vote, and the rights such as the right to a fair trial, to freedom of expression, and so on. And the notion of these rights that we're discussing today may be less familiar. So I was wondering whether Li Feng would like to say something about whether these rights are somehow different from the more familiar rights that are often called civil and political rights.
Thank you, Jill. I think that it's really important. It's been seen historically that economic, social, and cultural rights are somewhat different or less enforceable, or maybe less important than civil and political rights. But this is really not the case, and I think that it's very clear that these rights are interlinked and interdependent upon each other. For example, on issues related to the rule of law, equality before the law, non-discrimination, these are civil and political rights which are very much necessary for the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. The same with respect to fundamental freedoms such as freedom of expression or freedom of assembly. These are used to be able to make the call for economic, social, and cultural rights. I think we've also seen in many contexts that where people are standing up for their rights to housing, to water, to land, that this is also when they may have their civil and political rights violated. For example, excessive use of force to disperse demonstrations, or the prosecution of defenders who are defending rights to housing. So I think that this shows the linkage. I think that one other thing that is important to recognize is that in this spectrum of rights, very often violations of economic, social, and cultural rights are the source of conflicts and tensions in societies and in countries. That it is the removal of rights to land, to equal enjoyment of rights to housing, of rights to water, to health, that actually drive conflict and tensions. And I think that we've also seen in movements around the world just in recent months, where deep-seated inequalities in terms of access to economic, social, and cultural rights have paired with civil and political rights. For example, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of calling for social justice and change. So I do think that we need to see this as a whole of what we're striving for in terms of human rights implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted now to ask Ojango Omondi whether, from his perspective, the people of Mathare, for example, where he works in the Mathare Social Justice Centre, would consider fair trial, the right to fair trial, the freedom of expression, or education and water, which would he like to say whether some of them matter more to, as it were, his people than others, or would he put them all on the same level?
Okay, First, what I would agree with Alex is that these rights, we have them only in policies. Most of our residents of Madare and most of these slums, we only read these rights in documents and more so in our constitution. But when you come to the, like, we say that kukuja kwa ground vitu ni different. So when you are in Madare, what you think of is how are you going to get your meals for the day? How will you get money to pay your rent for your house, and how your children will get better education? So if we come to rights, I wouldn't say that we the residents of Madare or from the slum, we consider that we have the rights to do everything that the constitution have. Because if we say right of expression, we feel we are under the mercy of the government, and the government has the saying for everything that we do or we say. So if you come out to speak about how you are being oppressed, how you are being denied your rights of even expression, the government comes out with force. So I wouldn't say that we our constitution, but in our area of operation where we live, we don't have these rights. So it's so difficult for us to compare between the rights of expression, or do we have the rights to housing? Because in Madare, for example, most of us residents, we live in a 12 by 12 houses where we are 12. We are 12 people. So how will you tell somebody that I have a right to housing, yet the house that you are living in, you can't fit in. You have to borrow a space from your neighbor to live. So for us in the slums, these are just rights in the constitution and in government policies, and most of us just here, we have rights to food, right to housing, but in reality, we don't have these rights.
Thank you very much. As I said at the beginning when I read out our text, it sounds sort of simple, doesn't it? Everyone has the right. The more elaborate is the one about right to health, but as it says, everyone has the right to adequate food, and so on. When we talk about a right to freedom of expression, it's difficult for us to see what that involves. We know what expressing oneself is, and we could very easily understand what it means to have that right suppressed. But maybe some of these rights need a bit more unpacking, and I wanted to invite Elizabeth to unpack the concept of the right to food a bit more, so we can have an understanding in some depth of what is involved in one of these rights, at least.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill. Yes. So the right to food is actually one of the most basic human rights upon which other rights depend. So as you said at the beginning, we cannot talk about the right to health if people are hungry. You can't say that people have the right to food if they are hungry. You can't talk about the right to life if people are hungry. You can't talk about the right to education if children are hungry, because they will not even be able to concentrate in class. So that's many other rights depend on the right to food. But what is the right to food? The right to food is when everyone, including men, women, children, older people, everyone has access to food, both physical and economic access to food at all times that is adequate through their own production or means of procurement of this food. And when we talk about adequate, what do we mean? We mean the food has to be safe, it has to be nutritious, and it has to be acceptable, socially acceptable to the people. So those are the things we are talking about. And then the government or the state has obligations to ensure that people access this food and the different obligations. So it's both a negative right and a positive right, in the sense that it's a positive right because the government has obligation to ensure to promote the right to food, ensuring that the environment is enabling. We have enabling environment so that people can be able to produce their own food or to procure food through purchases. So that that is promotion. And then there is the obligation of protecting the right, so that the right is not violated by other people, the third parties, so that maybe people do not just demolish someone's source of livelihood or food. So the government has the obligation to protect that, and the government has the obligation to respect the right, in the sense that the government may not, like, for example, just one day wake up and decide they are evicting people, and they have not provided other means of the people being able to. This applies to all the socioeconomic rights. Like when they evict, they should be able to accommodate find other means of accommodation for these people, and ensure that the people have food. So if you evict people, it means that the people's source of food is disrupted. So the government should be able to step in and actually ensure that there is a source of food. So they should not just do kind of measures that actually put people, make people not have their source of food. And the last obligation is to fulfill. When they create an enabling, when the government creates an enabling environment for people to have the right to food, many people may be able to produce their own food or procure their own food, but there may be some very marginalized groups or vulnerable groups that may not be able to procure their food or to produce their food. The government still has the obligation to be able to ensure that those people have food. So it could be through safety measures or other means, but everyone has the right to food. There should be no one who should be hungry because they do not have means. But through all those obligations, everyone should be able to feed themselves in dignity. So we are talking about feeding, the right to feed oneself in dignity. So it's not just the right to be fed. So that's why we are talking about all those obligations to ensure that people can be able to feed themselves in dignity. Yeah, generally that's it.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Yes, you've raised some very interesting and important words in this connection. The way in which the obligations are broken down into the obligation to respect the right, which is in a sense not to do positive things to interfere with the right, the duty to protect the right, which means protecting the right from other people's interference. So having laws which actually protect people's rights to food and housing and so on. Then the promoting, as Elizabeth said, having an enabling environment, including policies and taxation, and indeed education that will encourage and support the recognition of these rights. And then fulfilling, which may mean really positive action. Another example might perhaps be when there's a drought, that the state might have an obligation to step in and make sure that people actually do not starve to death. And these phrases actually have been incorporated into our Constitution in an interesting way, because the Constitution says that the state has an obligation to observe, respect. I'm not sure there's much of a difference between those two words. Protect, promote, and fulfill the rights. And interestingly, it's applied to all the rights, not just to economic, social, and cultural rights. And if you think about it, that actually does make some sense, because sometimes even the other rights that seem to be quite straightforward may actually require government policies and programs and so on to improve and protect the rights. Now, with many of the civil and political rights, we probably can understand quite easily, though, what is a breach. If we if we see the police beating somebody up because they're not wearing a mask, we can immediately say, that's a breach of the right in the Constitution to be free from violence from any source. If we are muzzled by the government, we know that this is on the face of it a breach of the right to expression. But how do we identify in the same way? Can we identify in the same way a breach of the right to food, housing, water, health, etc.? I wonder whether Pauline might like to say something about what amounts to a violation of the right to housing.
Well, thank you. I'd just like to highlight a few things that amount to violation on the right to adequate housing. The first one, which we all know, is forced evictions. And this has been normalized too much, especially in Kenya with our government. So forced eviction is when the state or any other person comes and demolishes your house without notice, without the procedures that have been put under our law. We have the option of going to court to stop an eviction, like what we saw in Kariobangi, but sometimes the court does not respect that. Wholesomely, forced evictions are a violation on the right to adequate housing, no matter the reason. For instance, for Kariobangi, the reason was because Nairobi Water wanted to set up a sewerage system. Last year, Pangani, it's because government wanted to set up the Big Four agenda and do the affordable housing. In 2018, in Kibra, it's because government wanted to construct the missing link road. So we have reasons that are either infrastructural that cause forced evictions, or either political. Even in the case of election time, some people are evicted because maybe you don't belong to a particular tribe and so forth and so on. But whatever the reason, if the procedure is not followed, that results or that is a violation on the right to adequate housing. And one of the things that the Constitution provided for, and especially for very many urban poor communities, is because they saw there is a relief. In the past, you could not go to court and be given a good judgment if you have been forcefully evicted, but the Constitution 2010 changed that for us. And so we have very many cases nowadays that people rush to court to get injunctions, or they rush to court to get whatever other reliefs they want. But the problem has been the enforcement of these judgments. Very few cases to date have protected victims of forced evictions. For example, the Ibrahim Sangor case in Garissa, to date, the 1,000 households that went to court are still occupying that land. But that is not the case for other areas like, say, Mitumba village or Kariobangi. They had an injunction and still they were evicted. So you find there's really sort of like a lack of synergy between the judiciary in terms of giving court orders and the executive in terms of protecting them. And so that brings in a situation where, for instance, from our part, Hakijami, when you go to the community and you tell them, we'll go to court on your behalf, we'll get a conservatory order so that you're not evicted, they still don't believe that their rights will be protected even with a court order. So we've reached that point where there's a lot of tension. We're not respecting the rule of law as much as we have it in our constitution. The other part I wanted to talk about is the issue of progressive realization. So housing rights means that government over time will put in resources, but we have very many informal settlements. I think for me that's a violation on the right to adequate housing. To have somebody, as Onjugo was saying, living in a 10 by 12 shack you know, that does not amount to dignity. It does not amount to, you know, somebody having the protection that they can have proper shelter when it rains, in bad weather, and so forth and so on. And so informal settlements show that there's inaction from the part of government, that government is not putting in enough resources to be able to bridge the inequality gap that we have. And even if they do, you find that these projects do not benefit the urban poor. So other people get into those houses. I was asking the other day, we've had many forced evictions in Nairobi and all over Kenya, but we have the Big Four agenda. So who is on that list? The people who are supposed to be on that list are the people who are most marginalized, the people who are most affected, the people who are evicted from Kariobangi, for example, or the people who are forcefully evicted from Kibra or from Pangani. They're supposed to be first on that queue because they're the people who are most in need at that particular point. But we have commercialized housing so much that government looks at building houses as improving the GDP of Kenya. It doesn't look at affordable housing as bridging the inequality gap. And I think that's where we lose it. And for me, if we continue with that path where we have financialized housing, you know, we've capitalized the market too much, then we won't have informal, we won't eradicate informal settlements, we won't have zero forced evictions, because there'll always be a justification to forcefully evicting and telling people, well, if they don't come out from there, then you won't have a sewerage system in Nairobi. Well, if these people don't come out from there, then we won't have a road. So we don't have the notion of providing alternative accommodation for compensation or for doing any other thing that protects the rights of these very marginalized people. I don't think you know, one party is supposed to suffer at the expense of the other. That's not what rights call for. It's always supposed to be, if I may say, a win-win situation where the very marginalized are not put further below where they are. Either you gain ground or you hold your ground. Either you are not evicted or government gives you a better house for that particular reason. So really forced evictions, lack of budgeting, capitalizing the markets, all those are violations on the right to adequate housing. And also, given that government sees informal settlements as something that needs to be quickly eradicated, you know, it does not provide a good layout for Nairobi. Nairobi does not look as beautiful. What we almost saw in Muthurwa, the eviction, is because government wanted to put a golf course so that when you're driving into Nairobi, it's so beautiful. And you're not giving these people who are living there alternative accommodation or compensation or any other thing. So unless we have these things, then we'll always have housing rights violations, which translate to other rights, as Dr. Elizabeth said, on the right to food, on the right to education. If you're forcefully evicted, then you don't even have, you know, those online or the laptops to enable you continue with online education during this COVID period. You can provide for your family. You're busy looking for where do we put our heads during the night first, or how do we accommodate ourselves from bad weather, and so forth and so on. So all these rights need to be interrelated, and housing rights need to be implemented as a right and not as a commercial activity.
Thank you very much. I wanted to turn to Elizabeth for a moment then. What's the violation of the right to food? If there has been a certain amount of discussion in literature, I seem to remember, about if a Kenyan starves to death, is that a violation of the right to food by definition on the part of the government? Or if people have, as we have in many parts of the country, suffering from serious malnutrition on a sort of structural basis, if you like, is this a violation of the right to food? How do we establish violations?
Yes, that is a violation of the right to food, because as I said, everyone has the right to eat food, to have the food, to have access to food. And if the person is not able to produce the food or to procure the food for themselves, then the government has the obligation to ensure that that person gets food. So there should be no situation where somebody is sleeping hungry, or someone has nothing to eat at all, and someone dying of hunger because they do not have the right to food. So yes, it is a violation of the right to food. And of course, the issue of progressive realization is an interesting aspect, because in that, governments may give an excuse that they do not have money to be able to feed to actualize these rights. But at the minimum, there are some basic core standards, and food is one of them that should not be violated. So the right to food should not, people should not, the government should at least ensure at minimum people can be able to access food. So yeah, that is a violation. Yes. And it's rampant. It's rampant. And the problem is, this socioeconomic rights it's not like they are generally in the Constitution. Actually, in the engagement we've been doing in amongst like the urban poor, people see them as very far off, because they do not believe that the government has obligation to actually help them, facilitate them getting the access to food and ensuring that they have food. So yeah, so there is a lot of violation on that right.
Right. Are you saying that people that you've been interacting with are aware that they have a right, but they know it's not being realized, or they don't even think of it in terms of being a right?
Yes, from the engagement that we have been doing in the last 2 years, actually people did not realize that they have a right to food. It was like a realization and understanding what this right is, breaking down to them. And so it was like a new realization that they have the right to food, but they see the disconnect between what they now know is in the Constitution and what they can think that they can be enabled for them. So it's still a very big disconnection. They still do not believe that it can be actualized. So there is that big gap. And as I said, it's also that the government does not totally take it seriously that this progressive realization needs to happen. We don't have to keep postponing. It needs to start. We need to start and show progress. Every time we should show progress, not retrogressing. But as many times you see some kind of retrogression where the right is people are becoming even hungrier sometimes, and especially when we have emergencies like the issue of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. There should be safety nets, safety measures to ensure that people can access food, even during such a pandemic when they lose jobs. It doesn't mean that they must sleep hungry. Yeah, so those kind of things.
Thank you. I wanted to, for a moment, to shift to Ojango then, in the light of what Elizabeth has just been saying. In Ojango, would you say that in Mathare, people do not think that they have a right to for things like food and health and water, or is it that they are aware they have rights but are bitterly disappointed in not having been able to get the benefit of those rights?
Okay, thank you, Jill. Because me, what I will say that, we, the less privileged from the slums, we have a feel of what these social economic rights are. We know where it pinches when someone tells us that you have a right to access to adequate housing, you have a right to be free from hunger and to have adequate food and the terms of accessible quantity. But in reality, it doesn't apply, because it's like everyone for himself and God for us all. We are here for survival. So we understand that the life here in ghetto, we are here to survive. No one is for us, we are for ourselves. So if you ask me, do I know this right exists, are they real, or they are just in papers? What I'll tell you, okay, it's confusing. At times, you know, you are in your house, you are hungry, yet you have your constitution, which tells you you have a right to not to sleep hungry. You have the right to have accessible food, with quantity. Yeah, it's, how do we say, with quality. So, but here you are sleeping hungry. So it gets confusing that you don't get it. The constitution, which is the supreme law of this land, tells you that you have the right to this food. You have the right to housing, yet the house that you are living is a 10 by 10. And you are like 8 people in it. So I would say we in the slum, yeah, it's just confusing. You have the right, but you don't have the right.
Okay, thank you very much. Traditionally, of course, we tend to think of rights as being enforced by going to court. And this is very important, and we have some people here today who have a lot of experience with that. So I wanted to ask Alan Meleche if he could tell us a bit more about one or two of their really interesting and important cases that Kellen has been successfully brought to protect the right to the highest attainable standard of health.
So thank you so much, Jill. And before I get to the cases, the conversation has been extremely exciting, and I've been tempted to weigh in on the issue of progressive realization from the right to health. And I think the problem that we have in this country is that there is no clear plan. From when we got the Constitution in 2010, we had a clear plan in terms of the legal framework and the policy framework we need to put in place. But thereon, both on the national government and the county government, maybe say for Makueni to some extent, we haven't seen a plan where citizens are engaged and are told, look, this is what the right to health means. It means a hospital, it means information on not getting sick, it means accessing maternal reproductive health services, it means participating in decisions. And can we discuss what is priority and how do we achieve that, so that we know someone is not going to wake up a few years into his reign of elections and decide we're going to put up 3 hospitals in an informal settlement. Was that exactly what the people wanted? Was that the exact need that they wanted? So I think for all the socioeconomic rights, education, food, water, health, the fact that we don't have a clear plan that we can hold government accountable to, and by government I mean both national and county governments, and through our elected representatives at the National Assembly, at the Senate and the county assemblies, it becomes difficult for citizens to keep engaging and knowing, you set out this plan, are you actually moving in that direction? And that's then what leads us to come to how then do you hold people accountable? And of course, litigation is one of the ways to hold people accountable. But before you get to litigation, we then have to question, do these plans exist? Have they engaged people? Are they allocating money? Is the money not being stolen in the process of allegedly implementing the right to health? And exactly who is then missing medicines? Who's being denied emergency medical care? Are women dying because they cannot access a healthcare worker or access a healthcare facility? And then this leads us now to come to the judiciary and say, look, the law is saying that these people have a right to respect, to protect and fulfill, but I have a woman here who's being detained in hospital, yet there's a presidential directive that says maternal services are free. No woman should give birth at home, and women who give birth in hospital should not then be detained or should not incur any cost. So that's where the challenges come. And I would quickly speak about a case that I found to be extremely important relating to people who interrupt their TB treatment, particularly 2 clients we had called Daniel and Patrick. And the synopsis of the case was basically that TB, which is an infectious disease just like COVID, results into you getting onto antibacterial treatment or antibiotics that are taken for a period of time and have got several side effects. And so it turned out that, again, as Dr. Elizabeth said, these rights are interlinked, because you can't take medicine on a hungry stomach, you can't swallow your tablets with dirty water because it then exposes you to more sickness. And so the clients we had were clients who came from a poor background, and their role was that they were tea pickers. And because they had TB, they went to hospital, and again, on an issue of rights to information, no one told them around how long do you take the medicines for, what are the side effects, how frequently do you need to come. And so in that case, when they were given their first course of antibiotics and they felt better, they saw no reason of coming back to the hospital. And then they were marked as people who had, for lack of a better word, defaulted from their treatment. And the option that was used by the public health officers was not one that was embracing to support the rights of the person who is sick, but it was more of a punitive one, that because you're not taking medicine, you're proving to be a risk to the larger public, we're going to come and arrest you. And so these three gentlemen found themselves being arrested because they had failed to take their treatment. No one questioned why they didn't come back. No one questioned why the healthcare workers did not give them. And no one questioned why then do you adopt to arrest them, take them to a police cell that is poorly ventilated, that is crowded in the interest that you're protecting the larger public. What then happens to the people who are in custody? Then you ship them to court, they have no legal representation, and they've already been advised while in custody, you're better off pleading guilty rather than not guilty, because you'll spend more time in remand, which is much more problematic. So you end up with a judicial process that rubber stamps the punitive approach of the Ministry of Health, and that is how the clients then came to us. And so we wanted to question around, what does the Public Health Act say for a person who's infectious? Is prison the ideal place to take a person who has an infectious disease? And how can we impose the human rights approach towards dealing with infectious diseases? So that was the genesis of the case. And it took a while, as is the case with all litigation in Kenya, to be able to get a decision around this particular case. But luckily, the court did agree with us that their rights to dignity, their rights to liberty, their rights to information had been violated. And the court did direct and made a number of important directives, including compelling the Ministry of Health to develop a policy that is in line with the Constitution, that ensures we have a clear way that takes into account how we deal with people who have difficulties of adhering to medicine and have infectious diseases, and beginning by not using a punitive approach, but by using an approach that enables the person who is sick to make decisions, to have information, and to have a guided approach. So whereas this litigation did work for us, and even surprisingly, the government, though after a long time, did develop. So the interesting part was to say that you then had a policy, and this decision came all the way back in 2014, that was saying every county needs to set up an isolation facility that would take care of people who have infectious diseases, and you have nowhere else to hold them. And come COVID, you discover that that policy has never been implemented. There are no isolation facilities, and we are busy turning dormitories, high schools into facilities where we can then hold people who are infectious. So this then demonstrates, Jill, that yes, litigation is an option, but with socioeconomic rights, it depends on the political will. And so the question then becomes, as Kenyans, how do we trigger that political will to be able to get our MCA to understand, I don't need 3 hospitals, I need more healthcare workers, I need more information to prevent me from getting infected. For the MCA and the Member of Parliament to understand, I need clean water and maize that is free from aflatoxin so that I don't get sick and start presenting myself to hospital. But the notion we have with the government is more hospitals, more facilities, without thinking through, is there even enough medicine? And so I think the discourse, Jill, should be around how are we creating a framework and how are we holding our leaders accountable towards that particular framework so that these socioeconomic rights can be made available. Over to you.
Right, thank you very much. Because you had told me that in the past that this order, that the government had actually developed a policy, but now of course we're faced with the consequences of that policy not having been carried through. We did receive an advance question from somebody I hope is now participating about this question of giving elaborate directions to government, many of which are completely ignored. Your case was perhaps rather exceptional that the government did respond. And a particular case that a person mentioned was the Mitubel case, which again Pauline had also mentioned, which was about people being shifted away from living near Wilson Airport. And the court had given some directions as to what should be done for them in the future. This case is actually currently before the Supreme Court. But I wondered whether Pauline might like to say something about the difficulties of the situation when a court gives one of these elaborate directions as to what should happen in the future, often called a structural interdict, using the South African expression. We would probably call a structural injunction.
Thank you so much, Jill. Yes, the Mitubel case is currently at the Supreme Court, so maybe we'll not talk much into it. But I just wanted to highlight a few things, and I come to the structural interdict in regards to forced evictions. If you look at the Mitubel case, where you rightfully put some 3,000 households were forcefully evicted, despite an interim conservatory order that they had. And one of the things that came out of that case is that we don't have a good law on forced eviction to date. And I think that's why litigating housing is very complicated. What we have is the Land Laws Amendment Act of 2016 that just it has a few clauses on what needs to happen, but it is not very clear. It does not even give, a 3-month notice as one of the procedures before a forced eviction. It's neither here nor there. It's not as comprehensive as the eviction and resettlement bill that we had. And from the Mitubel case, at that point, we didn't have a standalone law on eviction. So at the High Court level, they referred to General Comment number 7 on the Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. So some of the things that we need to ask when we're talking about forced eviction is whether there's opportunity for genuine consultation, whether there's notice, whether there's adequate information that has been given to the victims of forced evictions. The police or government officials are supposed to be there to protect the victims of evictions and not to beat them up like we see, whether it has been carried out in bad weather. Kariobangi happened at 4 a.m. in the morning, it was raining, and so that amounts to a violation, whether there are legal remedies, because we don't see remedies at all. To date, if I can refer to the Ibrahim Sangor case, the victims were given 240 million in damages, and to date, they have not been able to get that from government because of the Government Proceedings Act that insulates government from paying successful litigants money. And whether also, government has put in measures to ensure that the eviction does not result to homelessness, because that's something that nobody thinks about. But when it comes to structural interdict, which is the supervisory nature of a particular judgment, for Mitubel, an NGO called Pamoja Trust was given a mandate to be able to supervise the judgment to ensure that I think they did enumeration, they worked with government to come up with guidelines on forced evictions. And upon appeal, the Court of Appeal held that you cannot abdicate functions of the judiciary to a particular NGO. And at that point, I think Pamoja Trust had done a good job because one of the things we get during forced evictions is that you don't know who's been evicted. What is the number there? Who has been affected? And they were able to get this data. Surprisingly, in another case, I think it's the, I can't remember the case exactly, but the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights was also given the opportunity to supervise the judgment. It was regarding the Soweto East Zone A slum upgrading project, and the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights was able to supervise, and they were able to ensure that all people or the real beneficiaries have been able to benefit from the Soweto East Zone A project. So you find, again, as I said in the beginning, the judiciary is somewhat confusing. For KNCHR, it was okay for them to do that. For Pamoja Trust, it was not okay. It went on appeal. Right. And so I think we have not embraced it as much as the South African courts have.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And I wanted to pick up exactly on that point that, you know, the issues of the courts, not everybody can go to court. Going to court is expensive, takes a long time, and sometimes you will be frustrated. So what other ways are there in which we can actually enforce or ensure the implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights? I wanted to throw that question to Li Feng.
Thank you. Maybe just to start off with, I think it's really important that the Constitution does provide for the enforceability of the Bill of Rights, and I think that this is extremely important. It's not always readily available in all countries. I think that just to note, I think that the very recent judgment of the Land and Environment Court in the Owino Uhuru case, which was related to lead contamination in a slum in Mombasa, I think that this was an extremely important decision to be able to recognise that the rights to a healthy environment, to clean water, to health and to life had been infringed. So I think that there's good work that is being done to uphold this, but recognising also that these are long and expensive processes, and not everyone can use these means. I think that one other method for enforcing the economic, social, and cultural rights, and just apologies for the noise in the background, they seem to be testing a fire alarm here today, is actually the use of human rights mechanisms, because Kenya is a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And for example, it will be submitting a report to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights within the next year, and this will provide for a review of Kenya. There's also the Universal Periodic Review of Kenya by the Human Rights Council, which took place in January. And these are mechanisms, albeit at the international level, to look at how Kenya has delivered on its human rights obligations under human rights treaties that it has acceded to, and there's important recommendations that have come out of these human rights mechanisms, which can be a vehicle that can be used to press for full implementation of these rights. For example, from the Universal Periodic Review, there are recommendations that were accepted by the government of Kenya that relate to the right to education, that relate to the right to health, that relate to the right to water and also housing. And I think that these are ways of working with the government to say how it needs to take action to be able to meet these recommendations that it has accepted. I would say that also more broadly, and it goes to the point that Alan Maleche raised, which is about accountability in a broad sense. So it may not be, formal enforcement, but accountability on economic, social, and cultural rights, I think is very much linked to participation and to political engagement. And I think that this is something that Alan had raised as well, that there was no plan for progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights that is really involving citizen participation. And I think that this is where enforcement can be done really from a bottom-up level, also in terms of monitoring delivery on these rights, what the inequalities are in the enjoyment of these rights, and also budget monitoring in terms of what allocations are made. And I think that this is where, when we're looking at political engagement, how this is a people's constitution, how the people bring the issues to the government in terms of these are not being delivered on for vast groups of the population, is another method of holding the government to account. I would also say that, in terms of elections, basing some of the conversations around issues that are priorities for the population is another way of holding the government to account, that these are the priorities that the population sees that a government would need to deliver upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, talking about implementation, I think it's time for us to give a bit more of an assessment of how Kenya has been doing. And I wanted to turn to Linda. I'm sorry she's waited for some time. How do we assess Kenya's performance as far as achieving the right to education is concerned? And what more do we need to do? And maybe while you're talking, Linda, you could relate some of this to some of the recent events and the impact of COVID-19, and whether in focusing on health, whether we have perhaps neglected some of the other rights, such as the right to education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you to all the panelists who raised such important issues that are cross-cutting. I mean, I feel like everything that has been said by the others is mirrored within the education sector as well. But in terms of assessing Kenya's performance in terms of education or realizing the right to education, I wouldn't put a particular score to it, but I would say that the right to education has different dimensions, and Kenya has tried to touch on these different dimensions. So in terms of ensuring that that education facilities are available, there's been an increase in the number of schools at all levels. With the constitution came devolution, and so we had an increase in pre-primary facilities, for instance, at the county level. We have, I think in the region, we're heralded as one of the most proactive spenders in terms of education. So we're spending about 5.1% of our GDP on education. And the president made commitments last year that this spending, obviously he had not imagined that COVID would come along, but he had said that we would get to 30% at some point, and that was the aim in terms of expenditure. In terms of accessibility, the free secondary education program came about in 2017. We've seen the establishment of government agencies that focus on marginalized communities, such as children in arid and semi-arid areas. We've seen the gender parity index narrow. We've seen 100% transition, which was announced earlier this year by the ministry. And we've seen also various interventions launched focusing on enhancing the quality of education. So programs such as the Tusome program, which is a national literacy program, or the Tayari program, or the Pride project, which focuses on school governance and school improvement more broadly. We've also seen the establishment of a quality assurance framework, the first ever since independence, I guess, that was launched last year. And then we've seen programs that are trying to meet the specific needs of children. The curriculum reform program, the CBC, while much debated, is aiming to make education more child-centered as opposed to our obsession with high-stakes sort of testing. So lots of things that have been done to uphold the right to education, but also a lot of challenges that we've seen that violate the right to education or infringe on, what has been laid out in Article 43 or 56 and so on. And just to highlight some of these challenges that probably lower our score significantly, I'd say. So in terms of availability of facilities, we know that we have about 30,000 or so public schools in the whole of Kenya, but this is insufficient to meet the level of education demand. We're all pretty familiar with pictures of one teacher to a class of 70 children or more. We've all seen the pictures of, really bad school facilities, especially around the election period. We tend to see our schools in such a bad state, in various parts of the country, including Nairobi. We've seen the rise of private actors and the commercialization of actors, as was raised by Pauline. And these, we find that there's even interesting models that are emerging targeting the poor, but not necessarily serving them in the way that they should. So there's a lot of equity questions raised by the privatization of education. We also know that in very poor areas such as urban informal settlements, most of education provision is by low-fee private schools rather than public schools. And APHRC, where Elizabeth works, has done a couple of studies on this. There's limited infrastructure. And while we're spending quite a lot on education, it's not translating into learning outcomes. It's not translating into 1,400 per year is not translating in the type of quality education that we need at the school level. Education isn't free. We go all over the country, Mathare, Homa Bay, Garissa. Parents are still being charged, admission fees and other illegal levies to have their children attend school. And there are various other barriers to participation, especially for poor children, children with disabilities, girls. We know that about 13,000 girls drop out of school every year due to teenage pregnancies. We still have about 800,000 to 1 million children that are out of school, and this is pre-COVID, not even during this pandemic period, and many, many other issues that I probably wouldn't have enough time to get into. But I think the main questions that have been raised, the one of progressive realization, and there was a ruling in 2013 in which a judge said that the defense of progressive realization may not hold for very long. So the government needs to be on alert that it's no longer going to be an excuse that they can use. And I think, just as the other panelists have raised, that it's very important to take a sort of holistic approach to addressing the violation of rights. We do need to go to court. We do need to engage in treaty reporting and engaging with the international and regional treaty bodies. We do need to ensure that communities are aware of their rights and shift thinking or awareness from one of rights as a gift to one of entitlement, and helping them understand their rights as well. And I think maybe just moving a little bit to the issue of the pandemic and what that has meant. Yes, the focus is on health, but I guess the Ministry of Education has made attempts to try and address issues of the right to education. So 18 million learners, there was disrupted learning for about 18 million learners. The schools were closed up till January, and schools were turned into quarantine centers and all that. But the government also sought to ensure that learning continued, and they set up online or remote learning interventions through the radio, TV, or the KICD cloud for grades 1 to Form 4. But I think, as in all these other sectors, COVID exposed the inequalities, the deep inequalities that are within our society as a whole. So as much as KICD went virtual, very few Kenyans have access to smartphone devices or a TV or a radio. And various assessments have shown, even in these last few months, that about 30% of households were not accessing any of these services at all. And those that were accessing them, the majority of them were doing it inconsistently. So obviously, because of the economic situation, there was very limited parental involvement and engagement. People were out there trying to survive rather than trying to take their students or children through homework, exercise, and that sort of thing. And then the allocation of resources. This is a huge debate. We're not quite sure where the money is going. We hear that the Global Partnership for Education has allocated a huge amount of national grants to the Kenyan government. We're not sure where it's being spent. We've had over 7 billion that has been allocated to be loaned out to the private sector, but we're not quite sure what the public sector is going to receive, how they're going to expand public facilities. We're not sure how the government is going to reach those left furthest behind. So girls, children with disabilities, the poor. There's been no discussion about how their right to education is going to be met during this time. There's very little transparency and accountability, and I think this is clear across all sectors, not only in education. So COVID has raised a lot of questions. We are going to have a huge access problem looming, but access isn't our only problem. Quality is going to be, it's like this sort of underlying issue that we don't want to discuss because access is such a huge issue. We already had a challenge with the current facilities, and now we're going to have to expand them exponentially in order to accommodate the students that were within the system. This is not even speaking to students that were outside of the system. We will have a lot to do in terms of clarifying the rights-based approach to addressing the crisis and making sure that governments can be held accountable for the decisions they make, that they can be held accountable for education provision, that they'll put the laws and regulation frameworks in place that are necessary to regulate the emerging models that are coming out during this period. So we have a lot of EdTech, education technology and ICT, and there's a lot of data protection issues and access issues there that are not really being engaged. Yeah, so maybe let me stop there. but that just gives you a highlight of where we are.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I think the time has come for us to shift to some questions. Then we'll come back to the panelists at the end, and they'll have an opportunity to say anything they really wanted to say that they never got the chance. And I'm going to read out a few of the questions. A number of them are directed towards Elizabeth Kimani about the right to food. Before I air those, I wanted just to point out there are two others, particular ones, and I might ask the panel for volunteers to respond. One of them is from Hilda Owi. She's asking about whether there is a systematic way of keeping track of what's actually happening in progress of the constitutional, the rights of these, the implementation of these rights. She says, for example, where existing data and research policies and legislation and institutional arrangements in place since 2010 have been mapped and gaps documented. Is that happening? This could enable recommendations to be forwarded to the government or relevant entities to promote national level action on actualizing these economic, social and cultural rights. Perhaps a pity we don't have anybody from either the National Commission on Human Rights or the National Gender and Equality Commission, but think about that. And the other one I would like you to think about is there a question about social security. This is from Christine Courier about the right to social security, which is also in Article 43, Clause 1. The government has in place measures such as the funds given to the poor, persons with disability, etc., which we know are very often don't reach the intended persons. How effective have these measures been in enhancing this right, and what more can be done? But while you're thinking about that, I will, obviously, I think people have been, by what Elizabeth is saying about, you know, a violation of rights to food, they now want a little more detail. So we've had a number of questions. One is the right to food the same as the right to be fed? Two are really about how do you enforce, what are the enforcement mechanisms. So the first one about was from Clarice Oganga about the right to food as opposed to the right to be fed. Jackson Oire and Josephat Oyugo are asking for a bit more detail about enforcement of the right to food. My colleague Lempaso Yanka has said, communities are most often than not unable to provide food for themselves because of lack of water. The connection again between different rights, or too much water sometimes. During dry periods, large plantations of food dry up. During flooding, huge plantations of food are destroyed by floods. If we cannot manage water resources well, we may not realize the right to food. And then there's another, there's also a sort of global question really addressed to Elizabeth. It's 10 years next week since the promulgation of the Constitution, and these rights are still out of reach. He's referring to progressive realization of socio-economic rights. How do we ensure that the government is held accountable? How do we measure progressive realization? I think this is related to the other question we had about data and systematic evaluation. And what is the role of the civil society in holding government accountable? This, I think, goes well beyond food. It just begins by referring to Elizabeth's reference to progressive realization. So, and then finally for Elizabeth, somebody has asked about, could you explain your global food vision vis-a-vis the right to nutrition, especially with regard to children? So may we invite Elizabeth to respond to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I will answer as much as I can, and I'm sure that Fang Li and others can also chip in and answer some of these, because these rights are quite interrelated. So on the question of whether it's the right to be fed, as I mentioned, there are different obligations that the government has, because I have seen questions about whether it's the obligation of the government, like to feed people. So the government has different obligations to create one is to create an enabling environment so that people can be able to feed themselves in dignity. So the right to food is actually the right to feed oneself in dignity. And so if that environment was created, there was that environment to be able to ensure that everyone can feed themselves in dignity, then we would not need to have people being fed directly by the government. But the government also has the obligation, if people are not able to feed themselves because of many reasons, economic reasons, any other factors, then the government has the obligation to actually fulfill the right. So in terms of promoting the right to food, so the government also has to put a lens of equality, a lens whereby the marginalized people should be given more attention. Like, for example, we have many people like in the urban poor settings. We cannot, people are trying very hard to work hard and to get food. Like, for example, in this COVID period, in the past, people have been working as casual laborers, but suddenly they lost their income because they did not have, because there were measures that were put in place by the government to ensure that there is no spread of COVID. But what happens to these people? The people maybe are just confined in their households because they are not able to go look for work and they are not able to find the work. So by the time the government put these measures to curb the movement, the government should have put in place a plan to ensure that those who are not able to feed themselves would be able to find a way of getting food. So those are some of the aspects. So it's still the responsibility, the responsibility of the government, but the person has the responsibility of ensuring that they are feeding themselves in dignity. But if they are not able to, then the government has the responsibility. And the issue of the right to food, as I mentioned, has different dimensions. It has the issue of nutritious. The food has to be nutritious, it has to be safe, and it has to be acceptable. So, like, for example, in the issue of safety, and I saw some comments about the issue of water. If people don't have water, that is a major issue in the right to food, because like let's say in urban poor settings where the issue of sanitation is a major concern, people may not say they have their right to food is being actualized if they actually do not have water. So by thinking about the whole issue of the right to food, it has to be a holistic thought. It's not just thinking, oh, we can just provide food for people and then they don't have water. So they don't have their right to food is not actualized because they do not have water and sanitation measure. I mean, their water and sanitation is not taken care of, so their food is not safe. But it's not only about so the issue of inequality is a major issue in being able for people to feed themselves in dignity, and that's why we need issues like affirmative action, issues of social security. So in countries like, say, South Africa, because the respect for the right to food, they provide social security measures for the marginalized populations and for people who are not able to be able to find livelihoods for themselves. They have like something called child support system where people are given child support. If you're not able to afford livelihood, you're given child support and you're able to feed your child or your family. So that's those kind of social security measures are needed. In terms of enabling environment, we talk about, for example, let me talk about breastfeeding. Breastfeeding, if all mothers could be enabled to breastfeed their children optimally, then for the first 6 months of a child's life, we do not need any other food, but we need that enabling environment to ensure that the child is breastfed optimally. Exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. But how are people enabled to do that? We have the maternity leave for women who are working in the formal sector. But what happens to the women who are not working in the formal sector? And these are the majority. A lot of women work in the informal sector. What happens to them? We need a social security measure that ensures that women can actually optimally breastfeed their children, so that we take care of the right to food for the children. So that's these are very interrelated, but the first part is for the government to provide that enabling environment so that people can feed themselves in dignity. People may say that, oh, the government cannot feed people because, I mean, it's not their responsibility, but from the human rights perspective, they have an obligation to ensure everyone feeds through their measure, through their ways of being able to feed themselves. But if they are not able, the government can step in. In terms of the issue of progressive realization and how do we enforce, how can we measure this, and how can we be able to enforce this? So the government, first of all, because a lot of responsibility is laid on the government, but the government can get support from other state organizations to be able to actualize this right for the people. But the first responsibility lies in the government. And there, as Fang Li talked about, human rights mechanisms. We need to employ those human rights mechanisms to ensure that we can monitor progress in terms of realization of these human rights, and also in terms of enforcement of these human rights. So, like, we have commissions that have been created in the Constitution of Kenya. We have the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, the KNHCR, Kenyan National Human Rights Commission. We have the National Gender Equality Commission. Those are commissions that are put with the responsibility of watchdog over the government to ensure that these human rights are being implemented, they are being enforced, they are being actualized for the Kenyans. In terms of the progressive realizations, the government, it has to be progressive, but it has to be shown like there has been progress. So this periodic review, the universal periodic reviews, can help to ensure that we are measuring, we are monitoring that kind of progress. And the people the population can hold the government accountable, the different populations, and the civil society can hold the government accountable. So according to the Constitution, the government may not just say that we do not have resources to actualize these rights. The government has actually to show that they have tried, and there are measures that it's putting in place to ensure that there is progressive realization. So I know there were many questions. There was, let me see what else has not been answered. Let me first talk about this vision, because someone asked about the vision. So, at APHRC, we put an application. There was a call by the Rockefeller Foundation for Global Food Systems Visions, and so it was a prize, and APHRC put in place an application, and we were successful. We were selected as top 10 visionaries, so we got the prize. And the vision that you have put in place for APHRC is for Nairobi, and the vision was to ensure that the people of Nairobi are food secure, are healthy, and Nairobi is a food secure and environmentally friendly space. And some of the aspects that we put in the vision that we want to ensure people are food secure, one was to promote innovative urban farming in Nairobi. And in realizing that we have a lot of food coming from the rural settings, but to ensure that everyone is food secure, there is also a potential for producing that food in Nairobi to ensure that people, even the most vulnerable, do not always have to depend on money to be able to feed themselves. So, someone talked about commercialization of food, of these human rights, commercialization of like housing and all that. So we want to ensure that people can be able to feed themselves in dignity through, where possible, being able to produce their own food. And it's great that the county of Nairobi has put up an act of parliament for promotion and regulation of urban farming in Nairobi. So if we are able to leverage on that, we can be able to promote production of food in Nairobi, and to ensure also that the food that people are eating is safe, to create demand for safety. One of the aspects of food insecurity across the socioeconomic divide is actually the safety of food in terms of chemicals. Some research, some report that was released by the KEFI in 2018 indicated that most of the vegetables in Nairobi are actually contaminated with agricultural chemicals, chemical residues. And so we want to ensure that we are doing agroecological farming in Nairobi, but also promoting the rural-urban linkages for food supply. And the other aspect,
Liz, sorry, can I ask you to wind up so we can move on to some other panel members for some questions?
Yeah, so the other aspect is food rescue system, where we ensure that food is not wasted. So where there is food excess food that is that it would otherwise go to waste, we create a food rescue system, so that food can be captured and redistributed into the system to ensure social justice, to ensure food justice, to ensure that those who do not have food can actually access food. So those are the key. And then agribusiness, to ensure that people can access food. We have economic empowerment for youth and women and other people in Nairobi, so that they can be able to access food economically.
Thank you very much. I wanted to move on to the question about whether there is an approach to systematic standards and measurement of achievement of these rights. This is very much connected to the whole issue of progressive realization, because it's connected to the idea that you are making progress and improving in particular rights. And I wanted to point out, first of all, that the Constitution in Article 21, Clause 2 says, the state shall take legislative policy and other measures, including the setting of standards, to achieve the progressive realization of the rights guaranteed under Article 43. And I wanted to turn first to Alan, and then to Linda, and finally to Li Feng, with a related question, which is, as far as health and education are concerned, whether the specialist organizations can say whether they or other organizations have some systematic way of measuring whether we're making progress toward realization of those two rights. And then I would like to turn to Li Feng and ask whether, from the international perspective, there are lessons that we can learn about how you actually measure whether we are moving towards the realization of the rights. Maybe Alan could come in at this point.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you for the good question. I think there are measures in place. Internationally, we have the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Kenya is a signatory to that particular treaty, and they're expected to report periodically. And I believe, working with a number of organizations, we have put in shadow submissions around that particular progress. But also the framework provided by the Sustainable Development Goals provides clear indicators that Kenya is supposed to report to, and particularly on goal number 3 that relates to healthy lives and healthy well-being, there are clear indicators that Kenya is supposed to meet and report against, that people can check against that. However, when we come down to the national and county levels, we see a gap where beyond the Health Act, beyond a few health acts passed in a few counties, beyond a few health policies, there is no clear standards and guidelines that you could measure the national and county government to see the progress that they have made. So you rely basically on the evolution progress that they normally present. You rely on a number of reports that the Ministry of Health contributes, but there's no clear plan as against the international agreed standards of General Comment number 14 that talks about health facilities available, are they accessible, are they affordable, are they of good quality? So this is something we need to consider, and I believe this also falls squarely in the role of the National Gender and Equality Commission, who are responsible for aspects relating to socioeconomic rights, to figure out what is the framework they are putting in place as an independent constitutional commission to hold government accountable on how they are moving forward on health, education, food, and other aspects of socioeconomic rights. So for me, I believe there are ways to go about it, but we need to invest more in making citizens understand how do you demand from these issues from our leaders, how do you demand to know how much money is being put in the pot for housing, for health, how is that money being spent, are there leakages, and if there are leakages, how is that going forward, and if a donor is going ahead to put in money, because that seems to be a modus operandi of relying a lot on foreign donors to put money for things that we're actually supposed to be paying from our taxes, how well is that money going towards that? We already know the drama that's going on with the COVID money, which is actually supposed to be strengthening the health system, but you're seeing a lot of leakage, corruption, and wastage, and that is what we've seen a lot in the health sector. We've seen it in the education sector. I'm not sure whether that's the same case in the food sector, but that's where our gap comes in as citizens to see how then are we playing a role with the people who work on transparency, accountability, and corruption, or anti-corruption, to be able to address this. So that would be my quick response in light of time and giving a chance to others to be able to respond.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Linda, how about the education area? Can we measure what progress we're making?
Yes, I think we can. And similar to Alan, we do actually engage in complementary or alternative reporting to the international treaty bodies such as the SESCA. I work for a child rights organization, so all the other instruments that have a child rights focus, we also engage with those. So at the regional level, that would be the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, or the African Commission on People and Human Rights. We also engage with the Universal Periodic Review. Kenya was reviewed, it was late last year or early this year, I can't quite remember the dates. And Kenya is also about to be reviewed on the 2nd of September in regard to the African Committee of Experts, and we were involved in drafting complementary reports in that regard. At the national level, the government is meant to actually issue an annual report stating, developments in education every year, but that hasn't been the case, and we have been trying to push for them to do that. So it is actually meant to be the National Education Board that's meant to issue that report, and currently the National Education Board does not exist. So, so that's a huge gap. In terms of accountability, then civil society has had to fill that gap, and obviously everyone tends to focus on their particular area of interest within the sector. So there's a lot of information, not much of it is very well consolidated, but I think civil society has done a really good job in terms of plugging the information gap, and especially in terms of highlighting the disparities and violations to the right to education. I think there's in terms of how civil society is organized around that, there's the Limietu Coalition, which is meant to play a coordinative role in terms of consolidating that data and perhaps disseminating it as well. And then the county education networks that are also meant to be tracking information at the county level. So I think we're also engaged, education stakeholders are also engaged in reporting on SDGs and all of that. So I think there's quite a lot of information, but more could be done in terms of consolidating it and actually using it to demand for accountability within the education sector. The last point was just that, similar to what Alan said, we do have a national education sector plan, yes, but there doesn't seem to be very good tracking in terms of the equity dimensions on the right to education, and I think that could be improved. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted now to ask Li Feng. It's been my impression that a lot of the stuff, national reporting to international bodies and so on, has been at a rather general level, rather sort of anodyne statements about we're doing this good thing, we're doing that good thing, and the other good thing, without a huge amount of really concrete information. Can we learn from international experience about how to make these things more measurable? Can we get standards, even if we haven't supplied them very well nationally, standards that we can learn from other countries or from international bodies?
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that just to piggyback on from what Alan mentioned was in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that the SDG indicators, I mean, the very comprehensive set, can be very useful also to pair up with what are the human rights recommendations that have been made to Kenya. I think that, for example, Kenya has just voluntarily undergone a voluntary national review of its implementation, its progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals just in July for the second time. And I think it's really, I agree with you that some of the reporting can be quite general. I think that can be also from the government perspective, they can't go into very detailed issues at a county level necessarily. So it can be quite more broad in terms of the reporting. But I think that the shadow reporting or the alternative reporting, the civil society submissions, that one of the questions raised is a really good way to provoke some of this discussion. The civil society organizations have been very active in their engagement with the human rights treaty bodies, with the Universal Periodic Review, and also with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is very useful to be able to get a little bit more granular in terms of what some of the obstacles are. I would say that in terms of trying to be more specific, and I don't have any examples from other countries off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but I do think that the issue of inequalities is really key here. And particularly from the Sustainable Development Goals, which the aim is to leave no one behind. So it means that those who may be more vulnerable, who may be more marginalized, who may be more disadvantaged, should be the ones that states are particularly targeting. And I think that that's an essential element of progressive realization, that it's, for example, on housing, as Pauline was saying before, there's the Big Four agenda and affordable housing, but yet we are seeing many forced evictions being undertaken in the name of infrastructure and development. And I think that it's trying to piece together these elements to really say that in order to really promote development for the nation, this has to be done in a way that doesn't make the poorer communities, those who may be more disadvantaged, pay in order to have affordable housing for a smaller number. But I do think that trying to track some of the inequalities and trying to measure the progress in reducing the inequalities is an important aspect. It's not easy, but I think that this is where data is really important.
Thank you very much. I wanted to raise one question that coming from the comments, which is about the role of civil society. We've had a few examples in these responses, but I wanted to read you a question from Helen Kithinji, who says, I sometimes feel that CBOs and communities feel overwhelmed with all those rights that we have on paper, but not in reality. Would it be possible to use a very focused, so in a response to a question about the role, what CBOs and so on can do, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what Mathare Social Justice Centre is actually doing to educate people and so on about economic, social, and cultural rights. What are you actually doing actively in this area?
Okay, thank you. Okay, as you know, I'm the convener of Article 43 of the Social Justice Center Working Group, and under the Article 43 committee, we do education, we educate the public, we do dialogues on the Constitution, specifically on Article 43, the social and economic rights. And we have a campaign where we we tell people to know their jua katiba yako. So if you know your rights, then you have the power and you have the voice to demand for this right. So what we do, we agitate for people to know their rights and to demand their rights. Like for Article 43 on the rights to water. On May, we did a demo. First, it was just a visit to the Nairobi water in Kayole to know why we don't have water in the informal sector. Unfortunately, they refused to address us because the question they asked us, one, do we have water meter in our areas? Are we being provided water by the government? So we give them our meter number so that they can address our issues. So the questions we had, how can we have water meters whereas we are in informal sector, informal settlement, the access to water is so difficult. We have to walk even kilometers to access this water. Then we go to demand for our right to water, then you ask us to give you our water numbers so that you can help us. So it turned to a demo. We were arrested because we went to demand for our rights. And after our agitation, at least from then, we don't have that frequent water loss. And as Mathare Social Justice under the Article 43 committee, we do awareness campaign. Like for now, we have dialogues all over within the social justice working group movement where we go and tell people as we prepare to celebrate the Constitution at 10, we go and inform people about their rights and how they can access these rights. And what we have the challenges where we feel that the enablers or the writers of the Constitution failed us when they used the word shall, the government shall. So we feel that instead of shall, it should have been used, the government must, because the government take that leeway like, okay, we shall, no, not now, it's in the future. Yet we still live, we are living now, even tomorrow. Like for the social security, we are being told that in the Constitution, the state shall provide appropriate social security to persons who are unable to support themselves and their dependents. And for us in the informal sectors, in the informal settlement, we are not employed, we do casual work, we are unable to support ourselves, we are unable to provide for ourselves, even our dependents. So if we go to demand from the government, we will be just told we shall ensure we do this. So as Mathare Social Justice and the entire social justice working group movement, we agitate for our rights, and we have so many hindrances. Like we go to demand, we are tear gas. Like yesterday, we had a memorial in remembrance of Chris Msando at Archives, and reaching there, we were tear gas. So we don't have the right to express ourselves. We don't have the right to even say anything. So we are just oppressed. So we advocate, we tell people to advocate for their right, to stand up and speak for their right. Unless we speak, unless we know this Constitution, we'll never have the time or the chance or even the voice to tell that the government and those in authority that we have our rights and the Constitution give us the power to implement. So what we do, we demand the people to empower themselves. And like Wanjira said, when we lose our fear, they lose their power. So we want to lose that fear to demand our rights, so that those people who feel that they have the power.
Thank you very much. I think the time has come, we're approaching 1 o'clock now, to ask each panelist if they have something that they were burning to say that they haven't had a chance to say. And I will finish with Li Feng as the one of the co-organizers and supporters of this initiative. With no particular order, maybe I will just have a look at my list of participants, and I'll start, if I may, with Pauline. What have we not allowed you to say that you really wanted to say?
Thank you, Jill. Well, I think I have said everything that I wanted to say. I just saw in the chat box someone asking about enforcement of judgments and rule of law. Yeah. And I think this has been quite a topical question over the last few years, that judgments are not being respected. We don't have recourse for justice as you know it. So for me, one of the things maybe we could embrace more is what we talked about, structural interdict, that could help with enforcement of judgments. And I also saw the Law Society of Kenya had come up with a somewhat interesting idea, to name and shame the officials that don't respect judgments, including lawyers, including private entities. I don't know how that will be efficient, but I think we need to think outside the box. Otherwise, I think the Constitution, as someone said in the chat box, will just be a paper promise to most of the communities who need protection of the Constitution in Kenya.
Thank you very much. Linda, what is it that we didn't give you a chance to say?
I can't think of anything at the top of my mind. I think maybe just to re-emphasize that it's important to know what the government's obligations are, and to understand, or for communities to just truly embrace the idea that this is not, the rights are not a gift or a grace that's extended. It's an entitlement that each and every person deserve. And yes, it's very difficult within our context to ensure that those rights are met. But I think we need to demand them either way. So I guess I'll just end on that.
Thank you very much indeed. Alan.
Thanks, Jill. There's so much to say, but time is little. I think for me, my closing reflections and what I've really still wanted to emphasize is that we definitely need to turn to a point where we are angered enough to begin civil disobedience, ask questions of institutions that are supposed to be working and they're not working, be it parliament, be it the judiciary, be it the ODPP, be it the Anti-Corruption Commission, and ask questions: why is our money for health disappearing? Why aren't we fixing health systems? Why aren't we paying healthcare workers? Can the judiciary be more speedy in cases that they are listening to? Can we have decisions that unpack what this normative framework is? Can parliamentarians at the National Assembly, at the Senate, and the county assemblies be more vigorous towards ensuring we realize our socioeconomic rights? So as we celebrate the 10 years of the Constitution, we should also be making a plan as citizens as to how we are going to re-engage and repurpose the conversation around socioeconomic rights. And this starts with all of us at all levels, be it a poor, marginalized, middle class, or rich. These are conversations we need to get into, and we all down our tools and say enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. There are two things I would want to talk about. One is about, Pauline had actually talked about it, commercialization. So like when I look at the Big Four agenda, when I look at Vision 2030, there is a lot of commercialization when it comes to food. But we should be the government should be looking at these things also from a human rights perspective. to ensure that we are leaving no one behind. It's not just about commercialization, about building our GDP. Of course, we know that when the GDP is good, people will be, people's rights may be actualized. But to start with, we need to think about everyone and ensure that we are looking at things from a human rights perspective, not just commercializing things. We need to think about the adequacy of the food, whether it's nutritious, whether it's safe for the people. The other thing I would want to say is that I'm really excited about the 1 million kitchen gardens initiative that the government has announced. And I'm really hoping that it's going to be implemented and then to actualize the right to food for many who actually go hungry. So really, I'm excited about that, and I want to see how it's going to be implemented. So and I hope it's going to be implemented in a way that it meets the right to food for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to the 3 sponsoring organizations. And I'm going to ask very briefly, first of all, my boss, Christine Ngonge, whether she has anything she wanted to say. She's been occasionally sending me messages, the last one I rejected. So does she have some final thought she wants to deliver?
Thanks, Jill. I really don't have any comments to add. I think it's been an interesting discussion. Of course, we don't have enough time to be able to address these issues in an in-depth manner, but I think we have been able to get the highlights of each and every issue in relation to Article 43 and where we are as a nation in terms of compliance 10 years after the promulgation of the Constitution. So no, nothing else to add. I think it's been a useful discussion. I'll just leave it to Lee to finish up.
Thank you. Ojango, a final word from Mathare.
I would say it has been a good discussion. And my final words are, our human rights come at a cost. And most of us in the informal settlement, we cannot afford to get this right. You know, poverty has deprived us our conscience and dignity, and even we have sold our power and rights to those in authority. Every election cycle, people die in the slum. Why do they die? The core reasons are these social and economic rights, the right to food, the right to water. So we believe that our leaders, those that we elect, they are our saviors. They are the only ones to give us these rights, the dignity that we have. That's why most people die in the slum area during elections, so that their people can enter power, so that they can provide them this dignity, the right to life, the right to housing, the right to clean water and this. Yet our politicians have taken advantage to that, and now they're bribing us, because if they have the capacity, they have the power to provide all this. For now, during this COVID time, the government has provided water tanks and boreholes to most of these informal settlement. Yet, other times we didn't have this work. So it proves that the government can do this thing when they want and when they wish, and maybe to achieve what they feel will propel them to power to achieve what they want. So, you know, for us, the youths and in the informal sector, we have found solace in reference to social security in chamas. We go into groups where we give money, we form circles where we give money to each other to contribute. Like we cannot afford to give an NHIF or an SSF our 500, our 200 monthly, yet we don't get the services. So our only solace in social security is through chamas, where we invest in each other. That's where we find our help. But if we rely on the government has always failed us. So we just urge the citizen, like everyone has said, we have to know our rights, we have to fight for them, and let's not give those in authority to take advantage of our rights and to infringe on our rights, because there will come a time when they will lose those powers and they will know that we, the people, we have the power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to Li Feng, for if you may, the things you really wanted to say that we didn't let you, and some final words from your angle, as it were.
Thank you. I think I managed to say what I wanted to say, but really I want to appreciate what a rich discussion this has been, and to say thank you to all of you who've participated in this as panelists and as attendees asking questions, and to Katiba Institute for bringing this together, and to Jill for moderating. I think this comes at a really critical time for Kenya, that we're marking the 10th anniversary of this landmark Constitution and Bill of Rights, but at a time also where the COVID crisis has really unveiled and brought to the fore a lot of the deep-seated issues, whether they be the economic, social, and cultural rights issues, or other civil and political rights issues that have to become priorities. So I think that this is a moment, as Ojango said, that the people have the power, and the Constitution recognizes this. And I think that it's an important time for reflection and agenda setting, and also really communicating to those who bear the political power what the priorities of the people are, and what should be the way forward in the next 2, 5, 10 years, from the people's perspective. And I think that this leads well to the discussion in the webinar that will be taking place next week on ways forward in the next 10 years. But thank you again to all for this very rich discussion and reflection.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can I ask if there's anybody from Katiba who wants to say anything more about next week that Lee has just mentioned?
Next week, we'll be having the DAD webinar. So the DAD of the series of 3, the final of the series of 3. What we'll be discussing is sort of looking at sort of a citizens manifesto. So in the next 10 years, now that next week on the 27th marks the 10 years since the 2010 Constitution came into operation, what are we going to look forward to in the next 10 years? These past 2 webinars should have given us a state of play. Where are we now? And what did not work as we envisioned? So if on that background, what now do we ask the government to focus on to ensure full realization of the Constitution in the next 10 years? So that will be happening next week on the 26th. That's on Wednesday. And you're welcome to join that discussion. So together we can create a sort of citizens manifesto that we can share with lawmakers and other duty bearers to say, we expect you to do this in the next 10 years, now that in the past 10 years, not everything was realized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. And for my final words, I wanted to thank very, very warmly all the participants in the panelists, and who have been so inspiring and educational and interesting. I also wanted to thank the participants who have, the silent majority really, who have been here, some sending questions, others sticking with us throughout these 2 hours. And I wanted to end as I began, by a text from the Constitution. This one is a very short one, and I was reminded of it by what Elizabeth Kimani said about the way in which the government must, we should have a human rights-based approach to decision-making. The first article in the chapter on Bill of Rights says, the Bill of Rights is an integral part of Kenya's democratic state, and this is the really important language, and is the framework for social, economic, and cultural policies. The government should not be doing anything without bearing in mind the human rights implications of what it's doing. In fact, not just bearing in mind, but being guided by the human rights implications and its human rights obligations. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Jill.